Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
So the past 2 years have given us a glimpse of what is possible with artificial intelligence. Some say that AI will have a transformative impact to rival or even exceed that of past industrial revolutions. Others say that there will come a time in the near future when there will be no jobs for humans. Meanwhile, there's a joke going around that humans will be still doing the hard jobs at minimum wage while AI is writing poetry and creating art. So how much of this is fact and how much of it is hype? What are the big opportunities and risks with AI? To explore all of this, we have a very special guest with us today, Mallory Knodel. Mallory is the executive director of the Social Web Foundation. She is co-chair of the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group of the Internet Research Task Force. Mallory is an advisor to the Freedom Online Coalition and also on the advisory committee for the Open Technology Fund. Mallory takes a human rights, people-centered approach to technology implementation with a focus on encryption, censorship, and cybersecurity. She's a prolific author whose works demystify and break myths about how technology works. And it's a pleasure to have you join us to talk about these things today. So welcome to All Things Policy. So to get started, how much of the conversation or the expectations around AI is hype and how much of it is reality? Maybe you can start there and then see how things go.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to follow up on prior conversations that we've had about this topic. So I care a lot about being able to distinguish between AI hype and AI reality because I'm so excited and invested in the real transformative applications of AI. And I find that the hype really is an unsustainable sort of capitalist marketing, really, that's risks tarnishing the actual gains we can make with AI. So I start out by saying that so people don't think that I'm a sort of AI doomerism. There's two poles right now. There are people who hype AI, and there are people who are afraid of everything AI related, even something like generative text and ChatGPT. So I'm not either. I hope that I can find middle ground and take a more direct approach. And I think it's important to answer this question by looking at where AI has come from, what is the real science behind it, and then we can extrapolate forward as to what is really viable, what is promising, and so that's kind of how I approach this problem. AI is data-driven software. AI is data-driven methods for both analysis and prediction, as well as generation, right, which is a form of prediction, being able to generate text or images. And that data, where has it come from? That's a really good first question to ask. Where has it come from? How much of it is there? And what does that mean for how good the AI is? So I think 2 years ago, you mentioned as a major benchmark, even though AI, the sort of first AI lab at a university was established in the 1950s, 2 years ago becomes such a major milestone because of the democratization of a very impressive tool, which is the generative text. Now, we've been using predictive text, all of us, for a while. It's been years that you could go to a web browser, for example, type in your query, and you get a sort of autocomplete based on what other people have queried in the past. That is a form of predictive text. So these tools are not terribly new, but they became so interesting because they were so good. And also everyone could use them. Everyone could use them for free. And so that democratization, of course, scared a lot of people. So there became this dialogue between, are we democratizing this technology? It's going to ruin our institutions and so on, versus this is so very promising. Look what we could possibly do with it. Maybe we can do everything with generative AI now, right? So somewhere, again, the answer falls somewhere in the middle. How did ChatGPT get so good? And I think that's another question about where does the data come from? So first of all, I think it's so good with caveats, right? It's so good in English It's so good for certain kinds of cultural contexts. Outside of those boundaries, it's actually not super good. If it's not an English language, if it's other sorts of cultural contexts, it's not going to be as accurate. It's not going to be as impressive, and that's because that's where the data has come from. So the data that has trained these models is mostly what's available out there, and so this is a problem of that has predated. The technology itself, just that there is simply such an inequality in the amount of data that exists in English that is produced by certain cultures over others that leads to this sort of inequality. So now with that in mind, let's think about how this might work going forward in other domains. So, for something to be as good as and as impressive as ChatGPT in other domains, you have to have a lot of data. And I'll be honest, I think that we might be at a sort of peak for this kind of AI because any sort of open data sets, any sort of big piles of data lying around have been scooped up already by anyone training an AI model. So it may not be that there's a future in which massive data sets can be found and can be used. So there are going to be natural limitations to the accuracy of an AI model if there isn't massive troves of data underpinning the training of that model. And I think it also speaks to this notion of inequality as well, that, unless we start to think about the data side of things, we're going to be potentially trying to apply AI where it will be inaccurate or there won't be the data to support it. And that means that the applications are going to be just as unequal as those data sets are currently. So that looks at, economic inequality and so on. So that's maybe where I'll start if that sparked any additional questions you might have.
Yeah, many additional questions, I would say. The first thing I'd start off by asking is, since you mentioned peak data, right? There's also this trend that's gone on where people are talking about the ability to now generate, say, synthetic data as a means to complement or supplement the existing online data, right? And the second thought, so that was one. I mean, how good is the synthetic data available? Can it get better? Will it get better over time? And might it be a good enough substitute? And the second question I had is, I see your point about the inequality because the most large data sets are in the English language. Does that impact all domains equally, right? Is that a problem in some domains and less so in other, maybe more mathematical, more scientific domains? Do you think?
Sure. I can start there. Yeah. To talk about the peak data just a little bit more, what I mean is, a lot of capitalism, and I'm not just talking about AI now, but like anything where, the model is essentially you find the market gap, you find the economies of scale, and then you make a profit. So, and it's often on the commons, right? We look at how companies externalize costs to the public, they socialize costs, they internalize the profits. This is the playbook. And so in the case of technology tools that are using AI, they're looking for data for free. So they can externalize those costs. They also externalize the costs of privacy and surveillance and so on in the process of that. And then they make the profit internally. So what I'm saying when I say we're at sort of peak AI right now is that all of the free data sets that might exist in the world, right? Databases that have been maintained by governments, things like Wikipedia that are, in my view, the most impressive technology we've ever created as humanity is Wikipedia as a sort of shared written history by all of us, right? All of those kinds of data sets they're already in models. Somebody found them, somebody has used them, and somebody's trying to monetize them already. So I don't know where you get future data sets. Obviously, you could get them from the government as it maybe offers services and therefore has citizen data. You get them from shopping and from other kind of commercial ventures. Like you can continue to create it, but there's nothing like just lying around anymore. There's no $20 bills on the sidewalk anymore when it comes to AI, like training data. Synthetic data is an interesting idea. And I will admit, I am not expert in the current methods for creating synthetic data, but I do know that the process of creating synthetic data is a form of generation. So it's kind of that you are asking the AI model to now create the data and take the data in as input. And I think there are limited domains in which that makes sense, right? There are certainly, like if you're going to train an AI on traffic light patterns or location data, like those kinds of things it's easy to sort of replicate and make synthetic, that kind of data. When it comes to sort of behavioral data, people data, that sort of thing, I'm less convinced that the synthetic data is going to lead to better models. In fact, I think a lot of the studies I have read have shown that the use of synthetic data will degrade the model's accuracy over time. And just anecdotally, I think this resonates with people who are paying attention and listening to the news. Right, one of the big piles of data that's lying around, right, is the web. There's a lot of content on the internet today, and you could train language models based on that data. But you also now, because of 2 years ago, you have this absolute explosion of generated content on websites that if you're training your language model today on all of the content you find on the web, there's a significant amount of it that itself was generated by AI. And so you're sort of starting to eat your own dog food, as it were. So I don't actually think I used that metaphor correctly, but I mean, I think the point people can understand, it's like you're now training it on things that the robot itself took in. And I think you asked then a really good question about, like, does the inequality in language matter for all kinds of AI? Now, certainly not all AI is language-based. There's a lot of AI that may just be about, like location was one thing we came up with. AI is being used in medical research. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily English-based data points. However, I will say that there's an inordinate amount or a surprising amount of non-language AI that depends a lot on English. Because the people writing it is one obvious reason, but also because we are, as a sort of language forward species, I'll say, we like to translate everything into language and then back out again. So in the case of images, when you have image detection software, so computer vision is notoriously difficult, to get robot to tell the difference between a cat and a dog is really challenging. It takes humans no time. Yeah. Maybe a better example is like household objects. To look in someone's kitchen and to identify, different items that are on the shelf is really tough. And especially when a lot of these models are, again, written in English, so that even if in your own native language, you have a slightly different word for certain objects than you would in English, they also might even look different. So researchers are, they're translating the name of the object and they're translating the object shape into a sort of normalized view of what that should be. Like an example would be a cup or a spoon, or, these things actually they don't just have different names in other languages, they look different in other cultures, and both are getting translated and then translated back out again. So you can kind of see how even with something like images, which is not inherently language-based, it becomes a language project because of the way humans approach the problem.
So building on some of the things that you just mentioned, so you spoke about how a lot of the publicly available data has already been used for training these models. So you then have these big tech companies who have built, silos where they have access to data. So would that then give them an advantage? And if someone else who's trying to build these models, will they be able to catch up and compete if that data is then used for training AI models? And is there a possibility of it being used? Where is that a concern? And adding on to that, we spoke about how it's not just English language, but also images. You might not have a labeled data set of images from a different cultural context or a different social context. So that might also lead to a differentiation. I mean, for a model that's trained on a vast collection of images that are there, say, in regions where these models are being developed. And if you look at some emerging economies where even for something like healthcare, you might not have properly labeled data for diagnosing conditions in that context for diseases that occur in that context. So it's not just large language models, but it could be a lot of other applications. So how do you see these differences playing out when between emerging economies, big tech, and the difference in access to these technologies?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. Again, I almost want to start with them in reverse because I think the promise of medical data being shared and sort of properly governed is maybe one of the more exciting or promising areas of work because, scientific researchers, medical researchers tend to have a more collaborative approach to their work. They tend to recognize that, it isn't a competition, that we are all here working on the same sort of end goals. And that's just how science is. So it's harder to, looking at big tech and looking at just like purely capitalist products and so on is a bit depressing. So the idea that, you have maybe not large language models, but you have a large models that are trained on a vast amount of medical data that may be coming from all corners of the world. And it's shared in a sort of more common way. I think that does sort of give us the imagination. Like if that isn't possible yet, or there are barriers to that, we should lower those barriers and we should do all we can to make sure that, doctors and medical researchers can share that. I do think there is an issue with quality, right? You brought this up, so I'll talk a little bit about that because I don't think it's come up yet, which is when we're talking about accuracy and how good the AI is, it very much depends on not just the amount of data, obviously, but the quality of the data. So it is really important for accuracy purposes, for the model to actually be effective, that the data be well maintained. And that is a challenge, right? It's a challenge that predates AI, just keeping proper records. And I'm sure we all have our own personal experiences of ourselves or some loved one we have had where interfacing with the medical system can be frustrating because the records aren't accurate or it's out of date. And that's just for us. And you can extrapolate this out to billions of people in various medical systems around the world that may or not be similar to those in other places. So that does sound like a very large project, but it isn't one that's insurmountable. And I think it's important, right, to think about how to optimize that and how to incentivize it too. Because I don't want to pretend like medical research is somehow not a capitalist project. It very much is in certain parts of the world. Like in the United States, there's a lot of secrecy and proprietariness around those kinds of research projects. And so, I think it's a really, really strong case, once again, as if the case hasn't been made many times before, for why, these endeavors shouldn't be capitalized upon, why they can't be proprietary, and, why data sharing and openness in data is really important and necessary. And that comes to the question you also included around data governance. So what is data governance? What does that mean? I think it is about more than just, okay, we have these big clean data sets, let's share them out. It's also about ongoing production of data and how that gets shared. So I think maybe coming back into the middle ground a little bit with between different kinds of incentives. So in a more capitalist product incentive, right, the data is itself just as valuable as the sort of end model because that is the thing that has been used to train. It's also typically a source. So yes, the data model or the product as itself was trained on a set of data in the past, and now it works a certain way. But part of what I think Silicon Valley has been doing for the better part of 20 years, really, is finding sources of data to monetize. So mostly in social media, that's been ad driven, but it's been about the data. It's been about collecting the data or having the data or having the users to continue to produce the data on top of which you can build products that are either ad driven or other kinds of things like, location data, selling different products like, food delivery or whatever it is, right? That is the business model, as it were. And so the idea that those data will be governed just isn't going to happen, right? Because that in and of itself is the sort of proprietariness of that company. But then how does this work with inequality, right? Like how can we expect new entrants to markets to be able to compete when, you have these companies that have been around now for many years. They've been building their platform on top of data that they themselves have been generating about the people who've been on their platform, how does one compete with that? I think that data often can be the reason why a company becomes acquired by another, right? They don't just want your product, they don't just want your website, they don't just want your workers, they also want all the data that you come with. So this is really, I think, important to point out, as data can be one of the most valuable assets that a big tech company has, or that these, and it does, it creates silos, as you're implying. It truly is an issue. But how to get at the sort of anti-competitive nature of that, I think, remains to be seen. And you're seeing some attempts at it. One that I can think of would be, for permission or having to ask for consent to access data. So we think of it on a consent. When we invoke that word, we think of it on a super fine grained level, like every single one of the users on a platform has to affirmatively consent to having their data opt into these platforms. Another one that's emerging a little bit more in this AI debate today is entire platforms consenting to the use of their data for the purposes of training a large language model. The New York Times has sued OpenAI because OpenAI trains itself off of New York Times content without paying for it. Wikipedia is a nonprofit organization. I've already talked about it once and how much I admire it. That has trained products that are now being sold. So there's clearly a licensing issue. There's clearly a consent issue. And so thinking about those kinds of things seems like the lowest hanging fruit.
Mallory, just staying on the topic of data governance for a bit, I guess there are these two schools of thought, right? So there is a school of thought that says that you should try to give ownership of data to every individual user, essentially leave it decentralized and figure out decentralized, federated ways of sharing data, right? But then there's the other thought that you said about, like, maybe when it comes to, say, healthcare data, governments are better suited to creating those data sets and then sharing them out, right? Where do you stand on that? Like, do you think there's value in thinking about decentralized versus centralized ways of doing data sharing? Which do you think is easier? Which do you think works better?
Yeah, no, I love that we're going to these questions because I don't have really good answers. It's the kind of question that I'm asking myself. So here are just the thoughts in no particular order. It's not a cogent position or an argument. When I've heard proposals about ownership of data, and these have been around for a while now, right? They were kind of sparked when users began to realize that the social media platforms they were using or the other kinds of platforms they were using were collecting data about them. Even at this point, like my grocery store collects vast amount of data about it, and I can't really feel anything about it because, I need to shop, right? Anyway, the ownership of data piece, I think, has been hard in a lot of his proposals because it puts a lot of onus on the person to be able to steward their own data. I just think, it's a lot to ask to remember the dozens of passwords that we already have to remember to log into websites. I feel sometimes whenever I have to go renew my passport or something like this, I just feel like there's a lot asked of us as citizens these days with respect to managing our data and managing our information. It almost feels like we ought to have one of our work days eliminated just so that we can be citizens, because being a citizen now is like a part-time job. So I don't know that any proposal that asks people to do more is a good one, because we're all overloaded. And I also think, right, these are things, talking about, again, like corporate externalities, like these are things the corporates are deciding that need to exist. And to then imagine that we have to externalize that labor to keep ourselves private and to keep ourselves from surveillance and all the other harms is just taking the burden off of the corporate that is the one sort of saying, well, we want to know all these things about you. So now you take care of it. You house this data. You keep your browser running the latest security software. You keep your device totally up to date. And if you don't, you can't even log into your account. Those things are high bars. At the same time, though, I just feel like there aren't enough discussions about, restraint. There aren't enough discussions about data minimization. So for me, as a privacy advocate, as a longtime technologists working in engineering spaces where the question has been, how do we make technology more private? The first response, in my view, is data minimization. It's not, how do you keep this data private? It's like, do you need that data at all? Is there some way that this can work without asking for those details? And I think there's just not enough. I think there's an expectation that we will continue to proliferate data sets. We will all participate in the generation of all of this data. And that is the future, rather than thinking carefully about, whether we should at all. And of course, we haven't gotten to this yet, but it's always a part of AI discussions now, which is that because of these large volumes of data, because of these massive amounts of compute, it just is terrible for the environment, right? These are sort of data centers all over the world, always on. They're never turned off. Our data is just sitting there. Maybe it runs through various compute cycles at various times, which generates even more data. But it's just, it's a really unsustainable prospect. So I think, going forward, folks who figure out ways to properly distribute data in a decentralized fashion, like you've said, without sort of asking too much of ourselves. Maybe there needs to be intermediaries that are part of the equation, but that this sort of minimization and this restraint actually comes back into the fold as a viable approach. I'd certainly like to see that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that you touched upon, right? So there's consent, there's so much of fatigue when you have to click I agree, or for every little thing that you need to share, and you just become immune to that, and you just accept that as a requirement to just go ahead, right? So moving forward, like you've touched upon a lot of different risks from adopting such large language models, from the environmental risks to the discrimination to the inequalities that will be created. So in terms of democratizing it, in terms of making the technology itself accessible to a larger population, one approach that's being taken is the promotion of open source models. So, and some companies are also pushing for it in sort of an attempt to own the ecosystem. So Meta has kind of partially open sourced their model and they stand to benefit also. So there's that angle as well. But how do you see this in terms of improving access to the technology? And do you think that they need to be governed differently so that it gets adopted more widely and you have a vibrant ecosystem around that?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And I think just to think about a narrow case, now this can't possibly be all of them, the idea that there's a lot of data. So let's use Meta. Meta's got a lot of data. They've been running a social media platform for a while. They have a humongous ad network. So that just goes to show, right, that the main product of Facebook is its ad network and all of the users that are generating data every day that helps improve the algorithm. That's sort of what's sold to ad networks. Come advertise here. We know they're going to get clicks. That's it, right? So open sourcing that makes, I think, a lot of sense, actually, because they already have the data. They're not going to share that with anyone else. Their model's good, so people are going to want to use it. And what they get out of it, so, why would they open it? Why would, I think the reason they open it is the same reason OpenAI opened theirs and Google wants to open theirs. Google is like the open source champion, even though they're not terribly competitive. We can come back to that in a second, but we're talking about Meta right now. So, they open it so people can use it. So that's a democratization move. It's great. There's going to be people who find value in it. It's going to be hopefully a boon for creativity and all kinds of other projects. But they're still keeping the data they had before, and everything that you do when you interact with that model, with those products, improves that product. So every query you put in, everything that you generate out, you're giving the machine feedback about, was this a good output? Was this bad? How would you change it? It's learning. And so that learning also stays with Facebook. So in what way is it open? It might be open in a lot of ways related to software. It might be open in terms of its access. It's not necessarily, I don't think, open in terms of data, but that's something to consider, right? So where does that data come from and who owns that data? That seems to me to be the biggest piece for future governance considerations, which you've already Rijesh has already brought up, and we've already been talking about a little bit. So I don't know the right answer, but I do know that we haven't been. I haven't seen a lot of cogent proposals that really think through the constituent pieces. And we haven't regulated anything like this before. I mean, we sort of had an opportunity, right? We're catching up now. We had years of opportunity to regulate, Facebook as an advertising network that is selling ad space based on datafication of the social media users. That has been known, and there has been a failure to regulate that. If only we had been sort of doing that earlier, and we're really good at that and understanding the equities involved, and working to keep a company like Meta from being so powerful, we might not be in this same position, and we might be both with smaller companies that aren't so dominant, and more specific to this question, we might have some experience with how to actually think about these products and how to think about properly regulating these products. We're kind of doing all this catch up at once. I mean, it's never too late, but I think we've missed some opportunities.
So one of the other big areas where AI is expected to have an impact is on education, skilling, and the labor market itself, right? So it can be a tool to augment capability. So it can be, you can use it as a personal assistant or a tutor to make yourself more productive. And at the same time, you'll see that it can bring about a digital divide in terms of those who have access to it and those who can't. So those who have will probably get a lot more productive, whereas that divide will just widen. So considering all of these things, how do you see education or just the job market itself evolving um, with such a technology being there, and the impact of that it has on people's productivity?
Yeah, I think you're asking the right questions about that. And it is something that worries people, right? The real material differences this is going to make in the lives of workers. And of course, we think of education as a pipeline for workers, so it's sort of included in that. And I want to talk about, there's a book. I won't talk about it very much because people maybe have read it or can go find it. But the book, What We Owe Each Other, is really good. It talks about the ways that technology doesn't really replace anything. It doesn't actually change forever the way an institution works or things like that. It just changes the relationship. It sort of shifts slightly how we engage, not in a way, again, that replaces it. So I think the key thesis, the key insight that I understood from reading that book, it doesn't actually talk very much about technology, right? It actually talks a lot more about society. But when it came to labor, I think that the major insight I had when reading that book was that, it is about being okay with labor changing. That in fact, because there is a shift in skills that are required, maybe because automation becomes more pervasive, what do you do then with those workers? Or what rather, actually, the workers can do with themselves, right? If you're not spending all of your time working anymore because you're not needed as a worker, maybe that's not a terrible thing. Maybe we can go supplant the robots that are writing art and poetry and take some of that time back for ourselves. I mean, I think it's the same sort of economic shift that I've heard recently, which is, unemployment numbers tend to be thought of as negative. And they are negative in the sense that if you aren't working, you aren't making money and you're not participating in the economy. But they're positive in that they indicate that, we don't need that much labor anymore. Like maybe we should all be working a little bit less. And I think that's a useful reframe. And it's something that I think of when I think about education and work for myself. So my personal experience with the ways in which these AI tools have improved my ability to learn and to produce are on both the reading side of things and on the generative side of things. So, and I'm a trained educator too, I'll just say, by the way. So a lot of education is the model for teaching is actually about teaching the skill, not the knowledge itself. It's about teaching children to sit still and focus for long periods of time. It's less about the arithmetic, which of course, we all have calculators for and so on. And so I think what's good about the shift is that it forces educators to focus more on the material and more on the substance of what they're teaching and less on the skill set that they are imbibing within the way they teach. So like a good example of this is reading papers. I read a lot of papers, and I will tell you that it is something that, if an instructor wants to know whether or not you've read papers, right, they will ask you to write another paper. They'll say, read these 5 papers and then produce a paper for me that explains to me, or, that demonstrates to me that you've read this. I've seen now, because ChatGPT can just generate this so quickly and so easily, they don't do that anymore. It would be a waste of everyone's time. And so the assignment has changed. The assignment is, give me, while you're sitting here in a test environment, or, you have 24 hours, give me, 5 bullet points. I don't want a paper, I want bullet points. And you can't really, you can of course ask ChatGPT to write the bullet points, but because it's such, the response is so concise, it requires such concision that the students end up having to do it anyway. And so it takes the busy work out of the equation, and it makes everyone's job easier. It's also delightfully so much easier to evaluate 5 bullet points from each student than it is to evaluate an entire paper. So you see, like, if you're really concerned about the knowledge transfer, you will change your teaching methods, and I feel like everyone wins. But anyway, that, just a little bit of an anecdote there.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, right? How education will change, how people interact with each other. There's a lot that it can impact, and a lot of downstream applications will again enable people to do so many things. So
let me ask one. I just wanted to move back a bit and just focus on the governance piece of it, right, that we just spoke about. Mallory, my question was, again, 2 schools of thought broadly about governance, right? If you listen to the OpenAIs of the world or the Googles of the world, they'll tell you, don't try to regulate the foundational model, just try and regulate the use cases, because that's where the real risks lie. But then, if you look at most regulation that's come out, it is the foundational models that are getting regulated. You do red teaming, you pay attention to what you're doing. You come back and say that, look, we think these security risks are there, not there. We've tested for it, right? So, but me personally, when I think of it, obviously it's a bad idea to tell large companies that you don't have to do any tests at all. It is you're spending a massive amount of money and making a lot of money on it, hopefully eventually. So you better test it to at least make sure that it doesn't do some bad things. But I do see some sense in this idea that it's a use case where you end up with, let's say, first order risks to end users. Right? So I was kind of curious where you land on that. How do we regulate that? What happens in those cases?
Yeah, sure. I'm one who will typically respond, why not both? We can regulate both the use cases and the foundation models when that makes sense. I do think that, just to talk about the use cases a little bit, that this is very important. And because you invoked, the time and the cost of investing in these technologies, that is something that a lot of folks are saying about the foundation models. I just want to point out that, the timeline on this has been exceedingly short, that, they might talk about all the effort and so on. What they're really saying, though, is that they were only able to make these foundation models covertly and without scrutiny. And then they launched them, and now we're scrutinizing them. And they don't want to go back and do it again with scrutiny. The amount of data that they had access to then would not be the same now, because the New York Times, Wikipedia, many other sources of data would not be comfortable with them using their data for that. So all of the things that they're afraid of are for good reason, because if they had to start over again, it would be different and they wouldn't have the same product they have now. If that's not necessarily a good reason, in my view, right? Like holding them accountable and thinking of like, okay, well, this is really impressive, now do it again, but respecting everyone's rights is a perfectly reasonable request. But the use cases, let's go to use cases, because I think for a long time, coming from civil society, I will just implicate myself and my sector for a moment. We have been talking about the harms of AI, the risks of inequality, discrimination. That has not been in short supply. A lot of us have felt like we are Cassandras and just not being heard, not being entertained in a serious way. However, I think part of the problem has been we've been pointing out problems. We've not been finishing the sentence, right? Like, this AI is harmful, and then we've stopped there rather than continuing to say, for example, it should not ever be used on, this in this way, or governments should not buy this product to use on, regular citizens. There's loads of examples where we could have been suggesting approaches to stopping the harms. Not to say that, we're all responsible, for these things, and sometimes just pointing out the harms is enough. I just feel like there were some obvious places, right, where, like, for example, recognition was it's been out for a long time now, but Amazon, another company, we haven't yet talked about Amazon. They have so much data. Amazon developed recognition, which was, facial recognition. It was a product that was going to be sold to governments. So they obviously spent billions on research and development. And then in the United States, anyway, civil society movements were successful in stopping the US government from buying recognition software. But what did they do? I mean, of course, Amazon is going to get a return on its investment. It just sold it to countries that had less firm rule of law and were, whether civil society weren't organized enough to push back, and they were able to take a very, very harmful technology and sort of level it against a population even less capable of defending itself against such a use. So I guess, I do think that there's a lot of regulation that can happen for use cases. Certainly, right? Like, a government should not be buying harmful software. Weapons and war is a really good, very bright line distinction that's codified in treaties. And, if your AI is not going to be able to abide by Geneva Conventions or other things like that, it just shouldn't exist, right? Like, you shouldn't be doing research and development on it at all. There should be no market for you to sell this kind of product. And therefore, that just shouldn't happen. Any kind of social service that has inequality in it should not be adopted, right? Banks should not be allowed to discriminate based on a bunch of things. Those laws already exist. They already exist in almost every country. Whether or not it's achieved with an algorithm or not should be immaterial, right? Like, you can take a lot of, accessibility legislation, discrimination, like, those things already happen, that the company has somehow figured out a way to automate those decisions should not matter, right? So I think it's already, what I'm saying is, I think on the use case line, there's a significant subset of those that could be regulated based on many existing laws as well. It's just, do you have the expertise in government? Are there enough sort of legal firms that are leveling class action or those kinds of things with proper amount of evidence and things like that? That I think is the work ahead as well.
So we've touched upon a lot of the risks, how governance should be approached, and to conclude, where do you think this is going to be heading? Say 5-10 years down the line, do you see it as an overall positive? Are there risks, big risks that will outweigh the opportunities that it can bring? So, like, I really like the way you framed it in the beginning, that AI is just today's software, right? So it's just software as we know it today. And is that how we look at it? And it's just an evolution of a technology, and regulations also need to, adapt to that. And it's not something radically different, but it's just something that's evolving, and we need to deal with the challenges that come with it. So how do you look at here?
I think this is an exciting time. I think for many of my colleagues in the human rights and emerging technology space, it's wonderful that governments are now taking an interest in proper regulation of big tech companies. It may have come too late, but nonetheless, it's happening. I also think emerging markets are ahead of the curve in that respect. They're hopefully, I think they're caught in a bind, right? Like, they really want to hold these big tech companies accountable, mostly because they're abroad, right? At the same time, they need to figure out how to craft policies and regulations that don't have the sort of counterproductive side effect that innovation is stifled. I don't actually think that's as hard as some people make it sound. If you're harming your citizens in the process of building your own local tech industry, like you're doing it wrong. You're just replicating what, the United States did many years ago. And I don't recommend it, right? So I think that in that sense, there's huge opportunity, right, to actually build technology that can be helpful. I think the other thing that makes me happy and excited is that governments are now thinking of themselves as procurers of technology. I mean, they always have been. There was this massive sort of privatization and digital, we called it digitalization. It was really just privatization of government services, 10 years ago or so. And I think that's, it's coming back in different ways, but that, governments are getting involved again and realizing that, they can't just leave it all to the big tech companies or to outsourcing it. Like it needs to be part and parcel of what they're doing. I think that is that's very promising, as long as, right, again, we don't imagine that these technologies replace anything that we already have, that the technology is there to enhance the work that we're doing, the institutions we're investing in. We're extending, the services we provide. We're not replacing every single, bureau and office with, a database and a website. That doesn't work. So in that sense, I think I'm very excited to see that, because I think more and more we use technology in a way that is enhancing and extending of current capabilities, we are going to get smarter about how to actually regulate it. I think one of the things is, governments have let companies just do whatever they want for so long and not participate in the daily provision of these services, that they don't really know how it works anymore. It's not that governments are stupid or like that's not, there's some people, right, who say like governments can't regulate this because they don't understand it. I mean, they regulate all kinds of things they don't understand. But also, I think one of the reasons why they don't understand it is they've just not been taking responsibility for serving it, right, for that service itself. So that is coming back into the way that a government sees its job or its role, its responsibility to its citizens is actually a really good thing. So, I mean, I could go on, but I really I think I am very excited about the attention and the care with which people are approaching these hard questions.
So I think the interest, and especially a lot of collaborative efforts across countries coming together to understand these things better, and in a sense build the regulatory muscle or the capabilities to do this will yield results, or will be better prepared to deal with the consequences of this. So thank you so much, Mallory. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and we look forward to more of your work and reading about the things that you're doing. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. For me too, it's really a good conversation. I'm glad you reached out.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.